Hello everybody, my name is Michael Harkey. I'm the curator of code here at infotex and your moderator. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them as you see pictured here. We will make sure they get answered. We'd like to point out destinations on our website, webinars.infotex.com, where you can find our upcoming webinar topics and event schedule, and then also movies.infotex.com, where you can find the movies of these webinars and training videos. And I know you won't forget to watch our legal disclaimers after the program. And now, I'd like to introduce the speaker of today's event, the awareness guru from Indiana, the breaker of tech and enforcer of policy. He has 13 letters after his name, and they all spell risk management. Dan Hadaway. Dan?
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and hello, everybody. As Michael said, my name is Dan Hadaway, and I founded Infotex as a managed security service provider way back in the year 2000. As my daughters put it, my third child will be old enough to drink this year, so go figure. But hey, I want to talk to you about 3 teams and a SIEM. You see, if you didn't know what I meant when I said managed security service provider, what that means is that we watch networks. And we've been developing our own SIEM, is what we call it, for 21 years now. We consider it to be a security information and event management system. And I've always learned that I before E, except after C, but know that some of our competitors actually call it a security event and information management system. And then a lot of people refer to this as a SIEM instead of a SIEM. But the weird thing is, as much effort as we and really everybody at Infotex has been putting into the SIEM, and you know, really what it is a database on steroids. If you haven't heard of a SIEM or a SIEM, it's, well, let's put it this way. We've been using big data tactics since before big data was a buzzword. And yet, as much effort and time and money, etc., that we put into developing that database on steroids, people are still surprised when they ask me, the founder of the company, to put all that effort into it to define a SIEM. And I still maintain that what a SIEM really is it's the synthesis of these 3 teams, and they might interact with this database, but it's these 3 teams working together as one team. That's what a security information and event management system is, in our opinion. Now, if you've seen me speak before, you also know that I kind of live in a cartoon. I use metaphors. Because I got my start in IT way back in the 80s in the video business, I like to use movies a lot in my talks. And so I hear what you're saying there, but no, I really didn't mean when I came up with 3 teams in a SIEM, I really wasn't thinking about 3 men and a baby here, but you could say the SIEM is a little bit like a baby, at least in the way the 3 teams interact with it. We need to feed that baby. We need to take care of that baby. We need to make sure that that baby gets the attention that it needs. But no offense to cute little babies, they don't save us. And I am a personal believer that a SIEM can save at least our reputations. And so that kind of a metaphor breaks down from there, right? So I'd rather, switch to a metaphor that has been working for me for quite a while now, and that is that the people working in a community-based bank, the people working in a small credit union, on the issue of technology and information security and cybersecurity and making sure that we're competitive because we're trying to roll out new technologies in a safe way. Well, we think they're cybersecurity heroes because of all that. They represent you, by the way, doing very much with very little. And if you haven't seen me speak before, if you don't know me very well, what you need to know is that I'm not really an academic kind of guy. I bring a lot of stories. I bring a lot of anecdotes to the table. I learn about cybersecurity by talking to Joe and Jane ISO. Joe and Jane ISO know more about what actually works and what doesn't actually work at least in terms of complying with guidance and that sort of thing. And so I really appreciate you coming to our webinars, and don't be afraid to email us or to contact us afterwards to point out where you think we might have been right or wrong, to ask questions, of course, and really to held a general discussion about technology risk management. And that's really what I'm talking about here today is technology risk management. Now, the word technology risk management doesn't fit very well in a hexagon, so I decided risk basics is what I'm calling that, but that's what I'm talking about. Technology risk management, and then we'll drill down on the risk monitoring aspects of it. And then I want to talk about those duties, both the duties that we divided and conquered, as well as the stinky ones that we have to share. And when I define what a SIEM is as three teams working together as one team, I want you to use and think about the word not synergy, but synthesis. Because I feel like the synthesis of the three teams working with the SIEM is what keeps us safe. And here's why. There's many, many, many different ways to define technology risk management. One way, the way I like to use a lot, is to divide it into three interactive processes that are executed both on a cyclical process, once a year we do our GLBA risk assessment, but also then on an on-demand process. Anything new, need to measure the risk. And then we're going to decide how we're going to respond to that risk, and then we're going to monitor both the response to the risk, but also we're going to look for the threats exploiting vulnerabilities that we found when we measured the risk, and we're also going to look for unknown threats exploiting unknown vulnerabilities. And we've all gotten good at risk measurement, I think, because let's face it, we do it every year. It's required as part of the FFIEC guidance. The Graham-Leach-Bliley risk assessment has kind of given birth to a whole bunch of other risk assessments that we do on a regular basis. But what's in common about them all, and anytime we have a new product, service, vendor, whatever, we start by measuring the inherent risk, which is where we brainstorm the threats and the vulnerabilities. We prioritize that by likelihood and impact and volume. Then we brainstorm what kind of controls do we have in place to lower that risk, and that gives us, if we're using good metrics, residual risk calculations, which we can then use to prioritize a lot of different stuff, including how we're going to respond to the risk that we discovered when we measured it. And there's a lot of different ways to respond to risk, but we could boil them all down to three different primary methods. We could transfer the risk. We do that when we outsource things, right? We're not developing our own internet banking systems. We've outsourced that to somebody. To transfer the risk is one of the reasons we've done that. We also don't want all the financial burden of having to hire coders and et cetera, et cetera. But we also transfer the risk with cybersecurity, insurance, that sort of thing, right? And we mitigate the risk. This is what, when I talk about risk response, most people think we're talking about the to-do list that we have that may have come out of our last risk assessment, our last audit, our last examination. And those are the new controls that we might be applying to bring the inherent risk down to an acceptable level. Now, while we're doing that, the inherent risk still exists, and we're actually accepting that risk until we've gotten those to-dos done. But we're also going to accept risk where we've decided, what it's going to take to mitigate this risk is just not worth the cost or the time or the hassle or the upset customers or whatever. There's a lot of good reasons to say I'm not going to mitigate the risk further, and we call that accepting the risk. And the key there is the right people need to accept the risk. We don't want the teller we just hired yesterday to decide, I don't like these passwords. I'm going to accept the risk of using weak passwords. No, that's something that would be done at the board level. So then we monitor the response, and we also monitor the threats and the vulnerabilities that we inventory during the measurement process. We've got to monitor the transfer risk, and we call that the vendor management program, as well as making sure that we keep our cybersecurity insurance and other insurance products, by the way, up to date. We monitor the risk mitigation. I think most of us are calling that our audit tracking process, right? But there might be other risk mitigation that's outside the audit tracking process. A lot of banks are applying MFA everywhere, right? And that's not because of an audit finding. They're trying to get out in front of the risk, and that's being tracked wherever, but it's risk mitigation as well. And we need to monitor that to make sure that it worked, to make sure that we got MFA everywhere. And then, of course, we monitor the accepted risk, which is kind of where the SIEM starts coming in, because the SIEM's really good at looking for threats exploiting vulnerabilities. And it's also really good at looking for the behavior of threats exploiting vulnerabilities that we might not even know about. And that behavioral monitoring requires gray matter, et cetera, we're going to be talking about. So, risk monitoring. I always find myself explaining to people why you would want to monitor risk. And our company really took off once the guidance started saying you need to monitor risk. But if the reason why you think you need to monitor risk is because of compliance reasons, which, by the way, 34 of the baseline statements in the cybersecurity assessment tool, or if you're a credit union, 34 of the baseline statements in the ASETs, what we call it, the automated cybersecurity examination tool, 34 of those statements are covered just by having a SIEM. And that's just the baseline statements. So, yeah, compliance is the reason why a lot of people went out and got a SIEM. But really, the reason why you want to monitor risk is because of all the other bullet points that I hope you've been reading while you're listening to me talk. And to me, the main reason why you want to monitor risk is because of what happens when you don't monitor risk. For one, likelihood is going to go up. It's just simply going to go up. If the bad guys can tell you're not watching, well, hey, we'll walk right in. But more importantly, if our employees can tell we're not watching, hey, I don't have to follow policies. So monitoring is not just technical. Monitoring is non-technical as well. That's why we get the marketing people, the HR people, the executive management on the incident response team. But there's a lot of other stuff that comes out of not monitoring. Change management issues occur when we don't monitor risk. Denial of service issues, compliance deficiencies. But ultimately, what shreds our cybersecurity superhero logo right in two is that we end up with unauthorized access. That's why we want to monitor for risk, because we need to protect the information that our customers are trusting us with. I'm hoping that all of you that are watching this webinar have seen some sort of a cyber kill chain. This is the one by Honeywell. It's kind of, a lot of people don't even realize it's Honeywell's version, but there's a lot of different versions of this. We used to call this the anatomy of an attack before Honeywell developed their cybersecurity kill chain. The industry's pretty much adopted this, but I just want to point, I'm not going to go over this again. We can give you a whole talk on the cyber kill chain if you'd like. But what I want to point out is that the word SIEMS kind of shows up here in the mitigation efforts in quite a few places. And it's important to know, though, that a SIEM won't stop you from exploiting, but it can stop you from delivering. Now, actually, just so you know, we kind of disagree with that. We feel like, we could still stop and exploit as well. I'm not going to get into that today, but if we did talk on the cyber kill chain, that's what we would be drilling down on. The point I'm trying to make here is that when we're monitoring, and why we're monitoring, and how we're monitoring is all centered around this. We're looking for threats exploiting vulnerabilities. We've got thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of signatures that say, hey, if this happens, it could be a threat exploiting a vulnerability. Now, I'm going to show you later that there's a lot of false positives in that. In order for you to do it right, you have to have, hey, anytime it could be, I don't care if it's a 1% chance of it, we want to know about it so we can investigate that. But the other important part of this is that there's a lot of unknown threats out there, and there's more unknown vulnerabilities than there are vulnerabilities. And I know the last time you ran your patch, scanning, in your vulnerability management program, you might have reflected on how many thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities it checks for. But there's more unknown vulnerabilities than there are known vulnerabilities, and we need to watch for unknown threats exploiting unknown vulnerabilities as part of the monitoring process. It's one of the reasons why we want to monitor, because we don't know everything that could happen. One of my clients always says, we don't know what we don't know. I actually have used that as a lyric in a song I wrote. We don't know what we don't know. And you've probably heard it. It's kind of a recurring concept that comes up when we talk about security. First time I heard it was when Donald Rumsfeld said it about the war on terror way back in 2003 or so. But we don't know what we don't know, and yet we still want to look for threats unknown, exploiting vulnerabilities. And the way we do that is through baselining and also baselining behavior. And we're going to be talking about that real quick here. I could go into, and talk at great length about everything we do monitor. If you're using another MSSP besides infotex, they've probably already gone all through that. And if you're using enough, you've already been through all this during our deployment process and every year when we do our annual review meeting, and then whenever we do retuning, right? We need to make sure we're looking for all these various things. But the main thing I want to stress here is more specifically is that we also need to monitor the health, not only of the overall system. The SIEM monitors the health of your overall system, but we need to monitor the health of the SIEM. And as you know, that means we need to get outside of the SIEM, which means we need the three teams working together as a team. We really could call that team the risk monitoring team. If you remember the first time we saw this diagram, it had the word SIEM there. And the three teams were centered around the SIEM, right? But the point I'm trying to make now is that these three teams act as one in order to make sure that we are achieving the reason why we monitor technology risk. Their synthesis, them coming together to make one team, is what makes us safe. So let's talk about what these three teams actually do in order to make us safe. At a very high level, the internal tech team is the team that makes changes to the system. The incident response team is the team that makes sure that all the moving parts are working together. And then the MSSP, or if you're a larger bank, the Security Operations Center. And by the way, we've taken to calling ourselves a MSOC instead of an MSSP, mainly because MSSP sounds way too much like MSP. MSP is a network support provider. They can change the system, and MSSP should not be allowed to change the system. And so we decided to go with MSOC because if you have a SOC, your auditors have already told you, hey, the data security analyst sitting on that SOC should not be allowed to change the system. I'll circle back around to that. But these are tools that we're using, and this is, the kind of, quite frankly, the decision to notify is the main reason why we get the management team involved. And now you can add to that the decision to pay the ransom, even though sometimes our insurance companies take that away from us. But these teams performing these duties have a real sufficient need to communicate. And how that kind of works is like this. The SOC is usually finding the issues. The internal tech team is spend a lot of time reacting and responding to whatever the SOC finds. And then the incident response team is making sure the internal tech team has the resources necessary to respond to those issues. And you could put the auditor here in a different process, right? So in risk monitoring, putting a lot of to-dos on the internal tech team's plate, just like the auditors do. And people don't realize that sometimes. That, hey, when you engage with a SOC or an MSOC or an MSSP, whatever you want to call that, there's going to be a to-do list coming over there. In fact, on a general basis, this is kind of the overall job description from a risk management perspective. And so, firewall management, vulnerability management, network administration, making changes to the system is what the internal tech team does. The network administrators, you could call them. The incident response team, well, they're making sure that we're hitting on all the compliance goals. They're looking at trends and, planning new resources and that sort of thing. And then I'm going to talk to you about probably the most important thing that the incident response team does, assuming you're doing it right. If you're not doing it right, then testing isn't very important because, well, you're not doing it right. I'll talk about that in a few minutes here. But also, kind of interestingly, there's 3 different time periods that these 3 teams do their duties on. The network administrators are usually, and I know this might be insulting to some of you who just stayed until midnight last night getting that latest patch to work because it wasn't working with whatever. But the general theory is that if you're on the internal tech team, you're there during normal business hours. You're expected to be available to the management team and everybody else during normal business hours. Whereas the SOC, they're doing the 24/7 thing. They've got 21 8-hour shifts that they need to fill. And all depending on the size of your bank, you might have to have a couple DSAs filling shifts. So you might have, anywhere between 8 to 12 people making sure that you can watch that network 24/7 by 365. Trained people. And then, of course, the incident response team, they hold periodic meetings. We still can't figure out why they can't do it on a monthly basis. We hear back that, well, we don't know what to talk about and all that kind of stuff. But everybody has a role to play. And the typical incident response plan tries to articulate those roles. Now, this is from an earlier version of our boilerplate. And the reason I know that is because it spells these responsibilities out kind of the way we always do, which is just bullet points and kind of all over the place. But what I want you to know is one of the deliverables, and all of our deliverables from these webinars, if you haven't been to our webinar before, are free. If you're actually at the live webinar, I believe we're making them available to you right now as I speak. Otherwise, just email us. If you're watching this by movie, just drop an email to info@infotex.com. That's how you spell infotex down there. And you'll be able to download these deliverables. But really what I'd like to do is I'd like to just kind of show you real quick that the deliverables always come with this transfer of copyright agreement. You're going to want to read that. In essence, it says that when you customize this to your bank or credit union, and these are all meant for financial institutions, but they're not that hard to customize over to people trying to comply with HIPAA or FSMA or some other regulation. But the point being is that you get to keep the copyright to your document, but we're retaining the copyright of the boilerplate, A. And then B, we're hoping you're not just sending this out to anybody. We actually charge for these when, if you don't come to the webinar, you can go out to our boilerplate library and download a boilerplate at a cost, $20, $30, something like that. But we don't want you just sending it out to everybody. Now, I didn't want to go over all that. That's not the reason I came in here. I just wanted to say all of our boilerplates talk about the document. They also, kind of an important thing to note here is that they also have iterations. And so this is just kind of like a one-off. We did one iteration to make a point. I'm going to be making this point here real quick in one of our webinars or our talks or whatever. But we haven't continued development. And so my point being is that what we did with this is we took a typical incident response plan and we put into place some of the things I'm teaching in this webinar today. The fact that it's really 3 teams acting together as one team, and that it's not really incident response. It's technology risk monitoring. I'm going to get to the fact that incident response is a part of technology risk monitoring, but it's actually a very small part of it. And then it kind of spells out the objectives, just like a typical incident response plan, but then you'll see that the duties are organized on the basis that a SIEM, or that not even a SIEM, that risk monitoring is 3 teams working together as one team. Now, the internal tech team, they're doing all kinds of monitoring too. It's not just the Security Operations Center that does the monitoring. And they're reacting to a lot more than just security stuff, of course. They're reacting to all the new stuff that got added to the technology plan the day after the technology the plan was finalized, right? They're reacting to the fact that the application A they brought in, didn't work the way they thought it was going to, or the vendor made them bypass a bunch of controls or whatever. And then this is the part that kind of comes a little bit as bad news maybe, but they always thought that the SOC keeps the baseline and the SOC uses the baseline. The MSSP uses the baseline. The MSSP relies on the baseline. Whoever's watching the network is watching it against a baseline, but it's the internal tech team that knows what changes are planned to the baseline and what changes have been made to the baseline since the last time the MSOC paid attention to the baseline. It's the internal tech team that keeps the baseline. So we need to talk a little bit about baselining. And if you're new to the concept, I feel like this is an easy way as any to illustrate what baselining is. But it's like spot the difference. So if you've ever been into a dentist's office, you might have picked up that Highlights magazine. I'm willing to admit that I do. And there's a spot the difference game in there always. And what it is that, hey, circle what's different from this picture to that picture. Tell you what, let's play a real quick game here. You probably thought I'm going to a webinar. I'm not going to have to play any cheesy games. But what I'd like to know is, what is different between this slide and the last slide? Well, don't you want to go look at the last slide? Right? That's what baselining is. We don't know what's normal. Until we've got that baseline, right? And we can't tell what's not normal until we know what's normal. Now, a few of you might have rolled your eyes when I said that, because it's a lot more complicated than that. And the reason you know that is because the cybersecurity assessment tool, and this is actually our tool that we kind of did our own version of it. For those of you credit unions, these are statements in the A set. And one of them is that you're going to, as a baseline statement, strike a normal network activity baseline. And this is all the guidance says. This is all they tell us about striking a baseline, which I'm glad of. I feel like the FFIEC is very good at making sure that they do a good job of defining the end result without painting themselves into a corner about the technology. This is what you might see when you're looking at baselining. And I don't want to spend a lot of time showing you what's on an infotex website, because there's a lot of different providers out there. But the more you baseline, the easier it is to spot the difference. Our data security analysts have been doing this long enough to where they can tell when this looks abnormal. I haven't watched a knock, and I can't. But our DSA, our data security analyst, is what a DSA is, can. I hope that everybody can see, there's an anomaly to the baseline, right? You've got the internal tech team is using most of the applications where the baseline is established. Now, what you need to realize is that we can receive logs and such from any application on your network, including your baselining applications. And then we can add that to the data we're already collecting with the sensors on your network as a part of your existing SIEM. And I don't know if you remember me telling you before, but about 1 out of every 1 million signature-based events are false positives. But we're still going to look at all 1 million of those signature alerts, because that one could be an incident. Meanwhile, on average, every 20,000 event logs, and they're logs coming off your critical devices, your servers, etc. If you're somebody that's been smart enough to decide, hey, I'm willing to pay for it, I'm going to have logs come from everywhere, this number substantially goes up. This number is based on critical devices. And 20,000 event logs produce one actionable event. This is why most banks are outsourcing the monitoring of the SIEM to a managed security service provider, because you need to have human beings watching all of these events and investigating them to make sure that they're not truly positives in the case of the false positives, or actionable events in the case of the logs. And so this is kind of an architecture of a SIEM typically. A SIEM is the database that brings together all the network traffic, which, IPS stands for Intrusion Prevention System. IDS stands for Intrusion Detection System. The IPS is a preventive control. It blocks, sometimes it calls it denial of service, but it blocks bad things from happening that we can predict. And then the Intrusion Detection System is where we're looking at these false positives and investigating them and making sure that they're not a threat exploiting a vulnerability. And the same with the event log management. A metaphor I like to use is that when you hear someone knocking on the door, what's the first thing you do? Well, you look out the window to see who they are. And that metaphor does break down a little bit, but think about it. We correlate event logs to network traffic to get the full picture as to what's going on. Then a SIEM usually also handles the change detection aspect of network monitoring. We don't want the internal tech team to report when they made a change to the firewall. We're trying to monitor changes to the firewall. So we go ahead and have the security operations center handle that type of reporting. And it's not just the firewall that can be included in change detection. We can watch for object access changes and that sort of thing. Anything that we want to watch because we know a change could mean that something happened bad or that something happened that could lead to something bad happening. We want to probably try to take a look at that in the SIEM with a couple of exceptions. And here's what I mean by that. But before I get there, let me just also say, and then the SIEM also becomes the tool that the three teams gather around. But before I go any further, I want to talk about the internal tech team's role, because you might be thinking, well, there's a lot missing from the picture, and yes, there is, but it's being handled by the internal tech team. Keeping antivirus up to date, keeping patches up to date, installing data loss prevention endpoint security applications. That's all pretty expensive if you try to outsource that to a third party, but more importantly, it requires making regular changes to the network. And we don't want the people watching the network to be the same people as the people that are changing the network. And then this all is tied together through a ticketing system, because the essence of this all working is the communication between the three teams. The communication between the internal tech team and the SOC, the communication between the incident response team and the internal tech team and the SOC, right? And what does the communication require? It requires human beings who can speak a common language, and those human beings need to have brains in order for that to work. What we wanted to do real quick here is to show you there's a lot of really good baselining tools. And so the second deliverable, and again, it's a free deliverable, but it's a link document. And I know a lot of us are like, I can just Google, but this is pulling together some important links that if you're not recognizing stuff on here, you might want to check out. These are relatively inexpensive applications that you can use to help with baselining. I'm not saying they're good or bad applications. I'm just saying that if you're not familiar with them, you might want to check them out. And again, that's available to you on the website. I'm going to, by the way, be publishing the location of that website here too. I feel like that's how you're going to be able to get those deliverables if you're watching the movie version. Now you might be thinking, well, if that's what the internal tech team does, you keep it a baseline. That's a lot of work. Well, then what does a security operations center do? Or what's that baby do? You might be saying, what's the SIEM do? This is supposed to be a talk about a SIEM. What's the SIEM do, right? Well, this is what the SIEM do, or does. This is what the SIEM does. It parses, it archives, it thresholds, it normalizes. I don't have the time to go into all the details here, and I feel like you ought to ask whoever your SIEM provider is to give you the details here. And by the way, if you are thinking about building your own SOC as a big bank, I wouldn't do it if you're anywhere near 10 billion or under. But if you're larger and you want to build your own SOC, well, there's a lot of good applications out there that you can use. But just remember, it's not the application that's going to keep you safe. It's the three teams working together as one team that's going to keep you safe. And the incident response team needs to make sure that the SOC has all these fundamental quality controls in place. It's really the incident response team that makes sure these are in place. The SOC, if they don't have them in place, needs to get to work, because there's a lot riding on just making sure that your auditors are going to be okay with the way everything's set up. You're going to want, we have it's called a SIEM audit checklist. The auditors are looking at your SIEM now, and not only are they going to want to make sure that we're hitting on all these quality controls, but I'm hoping they start asking, how does the incident response team plug into this? How does the internal tech team plug into this? Because what we want to avoid, by the way, is what happened at the Target breach. If you remember, for 2 weeks, the SOC was trying to get the internal tech team to tell the incident response team, we've got a problem here, folks, right? And so it's the communication between the 3 teams that makes us safe. And the SOC should be communicating, yes, we've got all this under control. One of the reasons why a lot of banks are outsourcing their SOC activities to an MSSP is because they just simply don't have the ability to stay on top of all these quality controls. But the other reasons is they don't want to staff 21 shifts to keep that 24/7 monitoring going. There's a lot of work involved in training and certifying data security analysts. You need to, keep that scene going and stay on top of the changes to the business of network monitoring. But when you do outsource to an MSSP, you need to remember that they're connected to your network, and that's a persistent connection. They're watching it 24/7, right? And what that means is that, in our opinion, they might be a critical vendor instead of a high-risk vendor from a vendor management program. In other words, you might be asking for the same due diligence out of your MSSP that you're asking for out of your core provider. They might not host logs, but if somebody compromises your MSSP, that becomes an APT, an advanced persistent threat on your network. And so this stuff needs to be in place. But ultimately, what the MSSP does is they monitor the database. They're the people that's making sure that baby isn't crying. Now, they need the help of the internal tech team, and they really need the help of the incident response team, because the internal tech team needs the resources, and the resource could be telling that management team member, hey, that wasn't in the technology plan. They're not going to have the time to do that unless we pony up some more resources. Because they also have to monitor the network. They have to keep the baseline. These are the managed security service providers, and we don't want our webinars to be marketing webinars, so I want you to know that these companies here are also legitimate managed security service providers. They provide just as good of a service as infotex, though I'd have to say that I'm hoping if you're engaged with us, you find that we're a better fit because we work with smaller community-based banks and credit unions. Again, an MSSP does not host PII, and they should not have access to PII. They're not allowed to make changes to the network, but they still have that persistent connection on the network. And a breach of an MSSP could lead to a breach of the bank, and because of that, you need to make sure that your MSSP is at least in the FFIEC examination program. If not, then you're going to need to review their third-party audits like the FFIEC does if they are in the program. But you should at least, even if they are in a program, you want to make sure, because the FFIEC, there's a TSP ROE, if you haven't got it yet, order it on anybody that's in the program. TSP standing for Technology Service Provider, ROE standing for Report of Examination. In our case, they started coming in annually, then they changed it to biannually. We just got it changed, or they just changed it, I should say, to once every 3 years. So we're on a 3-year cycle. But they look over every audit, they look over every social, they make sure that we've got the quality controls in place. They even look at our financial statements, they look at our insurance, they look at our marketing plan even. They make sure that we're keeping our clients safe. And one last thing is, I hope that your MSSP in the contract is defining what they mean by a response, and that they're giving you a guaranteed response time. I feel like those are 2 important bullet points that you should have in your MSSP contract. But one of the most important parts, after you've gone through all the compliance stuff when it comes to vetting your MSSP, is you want to test your SIEM. And we believe in this so much that we've actually gone as far as posting a movie teaching you how to test your SIEM. And we're actually updating that movie because we've learned a few new ways to do it. But if you're a current client of InfoTex's and you haven't watched this movie, you might want to watch this sooner rather than later, because you should be testing us. We need to be tested. We maintain that if the SIEM fails, it's usually because there's a lack of communication between the three teams. And we'd rather find that out before there's a live incident than after. And then for those of you who are managing your own SIEM, you've stood up your own security operations center, you've hired enough people to staff those 21 shifts. How's that working? Because we're auditing banks to start off with all good intentions. Our DSAs aren't going to be allowed to change the network. And guess what happened? Management found out about that because I asked the DSA to make a change to the network, not realizing what they were doing, of course. And the DSA said, sorry, I don't have that. Next thing you know, we're forgetting that the fox should not be watching the hen house. And so if you outsource to an MSSP, you don't ever have to worry about the president of your small institution saying, hey, give Dan Hadaway rights to make changes to my network. I own the darn network, right? Because you don't want a third party to have those rights. And so one of the benefits that kind of arises out of outsourcing the network monitoring process is that the people that are watching are not the people who are changing. And once you're actually in an incident, you learn to appreciate that. You really learn to appreciate that. One of the big things everybody's talking about nowadays is, this is going to date this movie, but the big buzz right now is we need to act as if we've already been breached. Well, then why aren't you segregating your DSAs from your network administration? That's all I can say, because that's when you really want to make sure that that's in place. And here's the main reason why, too, by the way, is because that actual incident response, and this is a fake graph, I just kind of developed this using fake numbers to make a point, but the actual response to an incident is very, very, very small when it comes to the time it takes to have a technology risk management program in place. It's preparing for the incident that should take the most time. Now, we have seen again and again and again, think about it, we've been watching networks since the year 2000, right? So we've seen over and over again good responses and bad responses. The people that can turn lemons into lemonade are the people that are spending this amount of time preparing for the incident, and then they really follow up on that incident. The post-mortem review process is what we're talking about here. The people that think incident response is about making sure you have someone lined up to say what we're going to do whenever we're in a panic, they're not able to turn the lemon to the lemonade. Preparation is 9/11 to the battle when it comes to incident response. And you want to know the best way, the easiest way, the least time-consuming way, as long as you spend enough time doing it, to be prepared for an incident? It's the incident response team. It's what they do. If you remember when I talked about what's the incident response team, it was about oversight and providing the resources and incident response testing. Oh, and then making the decision to notify or pay the ransom. The incident response test pulls everybody together. We've actually got an article, if you go out to our blog and search for the one test, it'll help your management team understand why they need to be involved in that test. And so I talked earlier about doing it right. All you have to do an incident response test right is A, test several scenarios that include notifying your customer, maybe one that includes paying a ransom, and then inviting the HR person and the marketing person, if they're not already on the team that has to show up anyway, and then senior management and at least one or two board members to be involved in the test. The test should cover everybody that's involved in an incident. Just so you know, it's not only the incident response team that gets involved in an incident. If you think that we're going to tell all our customers we just made a huge mistake, and the president of the bank and the board isn't going to be weighing in on that, then you have not been through an incident yet where you have to notify your customers, and good for you. But we are saying when, not if nowadays, and I just feel like if you want to act as if you've already been breached, well then act as if you've already been breached when you do your tabletop test. Back to the notion that we only need to meet quarterly because we don't know what to say. We came up with a solution to that a long time ago, and that is the standard meeting agenda. The standard incident response meeting agenda is for small banks and has all of the boilerplate language that I've already talked about. And if you notice, I want to focus in on this because this is where once a month we can make sure everybody understands what their roles are. And some are even coming into the meeting with information to share. And then meanwhile, make sure we're following up on what we decided in the last meeting. And then, we probably should review if there are any awareness training issues. Are there any reports coming off the SIEM that the internal tech team wants to bring to everybody's attention? This is something that's kind of old now that I feel like we're all in compliance with the CAT. But I think you're getting the point. You could have the incident response team meeting be an addendum at the end of your normal steering committee meeting, because some of you might be looking at this and saying, well, geez, we already reviewed this now. I might as well fix that now. Not going to get fixed on what you download, though. But anyway, enough said there. Let's talk about the shared duties. Let's talk about changing diapers. All right. Mutual reliance. Definitely something that my wife and I experienced and got trained on with our first daughter. She relied on me to do my share of changing the diapers, right? But when it comes to watching a SIEM, when it comes to technology risk monitoring, it's really getting the gray matter together on the three teams. Because awareness truly is 9/11ths of the battle. Those of you who have seen me speak before know what I'm talking about, because I bring this up in every single one of my talks, every single talk I've given, at least since September 11th, 2001, when we had to cancel a workshop we had scheduled, because we learned that day that awareness is 9/11ths of battle. We were far more secure the day after 9/11 than we were the day before, because we became aware of the threats and the vulnerabilities, et cetera, et cetera. So much to the point that a month later, American citizens, not law enforcement, American citizens stopped the shoe bomber from blowing up an airplane, and now we all get to take our shoes off in the airport, and none of us complain about that because we're aware of why. And since we're aware of why the control exists, we cooperate with the control. And so let's talk about awareness. This metaphor, I heard Michael Hartke, our curator of the code, use, and the guy that introduced me. And I'm like, oh my God, that's probably one of the best metaphors I've ever seen. And so we had Sophia, the person that's making all these graphics so amazing, draw this up. And so if you think about it, when we were talking about baselining, some of you rolled your eyes, because it's not like spot the difference, is it? I mean, if we're going to compare two static drawings, no way is that like network baselining. Maybe it would be a little bit more like it if we compared two movies, right? But Michael wanted to submit that no, it's actually like a lifeguard watching a beach. And the reason why is because one of these people out here swimming could be a 2-year-old toddler. Do we want to rely on the parents to respond when that toddler screams? The parents might be sick and tired of toddler by then, or not even paying attention. So we need to have somebody watching the beach. We call that a lifeguard. But every time that 2-year-old screams, the lifeguard isn't going to do something about it. And oh, by the way, see that lifesaver? He's allowed to make changes. So we got Joe, or we got Jane watching. We got Joe. He can go out there and make changes. She's going to find the issues. He's going to go out and fix the issues. But every time that 2-year-old screams doesn't mean there's a shark on its leg. But Jane still needs to check to make sure that that 2-year-old screaming really is an incident. And just so you know, I used to have a 2-year-old. 1 out of every 1,000 screams delivers an actionable event. And sorry, Dan and Jackie, if you ever end up watching this movie. But does this make sense? This is network monitoring, not spot the difference. And this metaphor breaks down too a little bit, but man, I'm telling you, it's a good metaphor. I'm liking it. And by the way, we're not going to be able to automate what Jane does. We can automate some of it, and we can give her tools like the binoculars. And we can kind of let her know, hey, my 2-year-old screams a lot. Sorry about that, when she actually had Joe react to the false positive. But do you see how this is 3 teams the internal tech team, the incident response team, Jane, and then that 2-year-old could be a threat exploiting a vulnerability. The collaboration is where the rubber meets the road in terms of us being safe. The collaboration is why I'm giving this talk, this webinar. The collaboration is why, even though we've spent thousands, I don't know how much we spent, I don't want to, in hours developing our database on steroid, I still maintain it's the 3 teams working together as one team that makes us safe. And where do we collaborate? Well, obviously in the decision to notify our customers or not, by the way, that, this is, if you've done a good job of preparation, a lot of times you don't have to notify your customers, here to tell you. I've seen it happen again and again. If you've done a good job of preparation, which means getting the 3 teams together on a regular basis, make sure they're communicating each other well. If you've done a good job on that, even if you do need to notify your customers, you will have customers come into your branch and giving you kudos. I'm here to tell you I've seen that happen again and again and again with those who understood what collaboration was for in technology risk monitoring. Because we need to make sure that SIEM is healthy. And that takes a lot of work on the part of the internal tech team. And the incident response team needs to make sure that they follow up when the SIEM still isn't healthy. And they make sure that the internal tech team has the resources to keep that SIEM healthy. And what do I mean by that? Well, every time we add a new asset, we have to get something on it to make sure that it's reporting to the SIEM. And then guess what? As we make changes to that asset, it stops reporting to the SIEM. And things like that. There's a lot more than just that. We need to retune the systems on a regular basis, et cetera, et cetera. All 3 of us need to be creating that paper trail. The great thing about a SIEM is it's layering a really nice paper trail with those event logs. It establishes the context. As long as you're not doing anything wrong, you want to keep those logs forever. Everybody keeps asking, how long should we keep the logs? I keep saying forever, unless you're not doing, unless you're committing a crime, well, then you would, you know what I mean? But if you're doing everything right, if you're up and up, why wouldn't you want to keep the context that proves that you were doing the right thing? Baseline is maintained by the internal tech team, but the SOC's very interested in it because we need to check against it, right? That's what this is, right? And the incident response team should be very interested in it because it's not an easy thing to do, and we need to make sure it's being kept up to date and all that kind of stuff. We talked about the 1 test, the incident response test. Now I want to talk about threat hunting. It's what we've always done. It was a new buzzword, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago. We were like, what? And we looked into it and we're like, oh, that's what we've always done. But then we started latching onto it as a metaphor and realized, wow, we can leverage this buzzword. This is what a threat hunting is, proactive process of gathering intelligence to, go after threats. Threat hunting. It's a great metaphor. But the non-technical team can really be involved in it. The incident response team is involved in threat hunting just as much as the security operations center. And we already know, and I forgot to already say this, but the internal tech team's doing as much monitoring as anybody else. They're no fools. They're not going to rely on the SOC only. They're going to make sure that the SOC's reporting what they think the SOC should report. Love it. That's exactly a role that the internal tech team needs to hold dear. And they're doing threat hunting on their own when they find the time. And hopefully they're testing that SIEM to make sure that everything's working right, using that movie, the practices in that movie. But the internal tech team isn't going to know about everything that the management team knows. That, by the way, is a precursor of extra risk, right? The internal tech team isn't going to be able to watch itself. When we have third parties come onto our network, we don't want to stay up all night to the hour to make sure that we're there while they're doing their work. We might have employees who are always clicking on links. Maybe we put a watch on them just to keep them safe. If someone's supposed to make changes when they're on vacation, well, why don't we have the SIEM report if this person's on vacation making changes? This is where a lot of internal threat risk is, right? The insider threat's usually the guy we just fired. Well, sometimes the guy or woman we just fired. Anytime we bring on new employees, they represent more risk until they've signed off on everything and have been trained. Why not put a watch on them? So the management team does threat hunting, and guess what? They do it by using their gray matter to communicate to the other 2 teams. Maybe they don't want the internal threat team to know that we're going to lay off 30 people, but they can still reach out to the SOC. And it needs to happen all the time by all three teams. Because I'm the managing partner of a SIEM provider, and I'm often asked, hey, Dan, with machine learning and neural networks, big data, artificial intelligence, what does the future of the SIEM look like? And I'm here to tell you, if we want to be safe, the future of the SIEM will be three teams working together as one. That's the future SIEM. I don't know what database they're going to be working around. The one we have now is substantially different than the one we had 5 years ago. But I do know there will be three teams working together as one team because we need that gray matter communicating. And you might think, oh, well, maybe we can automate that somewhere down the road. Well, I don't know. I had a vision into the 24th century, and we did have to make one change if we were going to write a policy, sentient beings, not human beings. All right? But it's always going to require, there's gray matter up there. It's always going to require gray matter. The future SIEM will always be three teams working as one team. Now, I'm really proud of something we're doing for the future of our database, and so I have to share this with you before I go. And this is something it was super top secret 5 years ago, and then we kind of announced it at a conference. Now we're ready to kind of put it in a movie and put it out there. But right now, the incident response process as defined by NIST is detect, respond, notify, train, and it's cyclical. And in theory, it should be organized around a SIEM. But in practice, this is what happens, right? It's really just a detect and response process that's organized around the SIEM. Then a report sent, and we got to do a lot of back and forth and everything, and the training isn't even covered. And so we envision this. We envision this as the future of the SIEM, that the SIEM is really a place. We call this the SIEM as a place. And what we're really talking about here is pulling in all the information involved in event management. If you think that event management just happens when the event occurs, then you didn't agree with that graph I showed you, where 95% of that pie chart was preparation, and then just a little sliver of it was response, and then we have follow-up, right? If you look here, the SIEM inputs, that's the whole chart. That's the whole SIEM right there. Everything we've been talking about when we talk about a security information event management system, that's the database. This is everything else. There's a lot more involved that the three teams need to have access to on a regular basis. And by the way, there's a standard agenda. There's a response wizard. We're going to keep a nice paper trail of everything. A lot of it will be automated, but you want to know what won't be automated? The gray matter. And so if you're wondering where those deliverables are, well, hey, they're right here. Technology risk management procedure, baseline tools, the standard meeting agenda. You can get there, my.infotex.com, 3-teams-SIEM. Michael, I'm going to throw it back to you to see if there are any questions in the live webinar.
So thank you very much for joining me here today. Let's make it a safe as well as successful 2021. And never forget, awareness is 9/11 of the battle.
Great information as always. Thanks, Dan, and thank you for joining us today.
When you view an infotex webinar or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you're agreeing to the terms posted at the web page listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what infotex presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with infotex webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but Infotex reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our transfer of copyright agreement at the webpage listed in this slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the web page shown on this slide. Be sure to check out our movie on how to test your SIEM, located on movies.infotex.com.